Alrighty, next up we're going to talk about a really important pattern in React where we pass functions down to child components and call them from within the child components. So this is very common, as I already mentioned. A lot of the time we have child components that are display things, are not stateful, there's no state at all, but they need to tell their parents to change state. There's usually a centralized place for a lot of the state, and then various children components need to speak up to the parent component and say, hey, I want to change that part of the state. So how do we do this? How do we send data back up the chain to a parent component? Very important question. So here's how the data flows. A parent component has some function on it. Let's call it change color. It passes that function down as a prop to the child component. Then the child component has that prop and can invoke that function as a prop, this.props.changeColor. And then that calls the function in the parent, which usually sets the new state or updates the state or does something. And then because that causes a change in the parent state, everything is re-rendered, including the children, which gets new props. So let me show you a simple example. I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. The first is not the ideal way. So what we're doing here is we have a list of numbers, very, very simple, no CSS. And each one of these is a child component called number item. So there's a number list, and then it renders a list of number items. Right now, these buttons don't work. I want to be able to delete one of these when we click on them. So if we come over here, I'll show you what I have. Number list has state, where it's storing an array called nums, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We iterate over those nums, we map them to a new array where we're making a number item for each one, and we pass in a value called n, which is coming from map. And number item looks it's super simple, just like this. It returns an li where we're displaying the value, the number, like 1, 2, 3, and then a button that currently does nothing. So if I want this X button to work, I need to have some sort of on-click functionality in here that calls a function in the parent. And that parent function is called remove. I've already defined it just to save time. So you pass in a number to remove, and it is going to find that number in the nums in the state and remove it using filter, and then reset the state with set state. So remember all that we talked about earlier about patterns with set state using pure functions. Instead of mutating the existing array and trying to remove something from that array, we make a copy of it with the item we're looking for removed using filter. Then we take that new array and set it as nums. Okay, so this remove function works. Trust me, I've already tested it. But we need a way to tell number item to use it. How do we get it down here? And the first way I'm going to show you, again, this is not necessarily the best, is to pass it in. So as a prop, we'll call it remove. It's up to us. This is just a name that we're giving it. And we do need to bind it. We can use an arrow function, this.remove, and then we pass in n, which is the value. So we're passing it as a prop. So inside of number item, if we reference this.props, which I'm going to leave this alone for now, I'm just going to pass it in. We're not using it. But if we come over here and look using the React Dev tools, don't worry about this message. We will be fixing that. We'll get to the bottom of key and what it's talking about by the end of this section. But if we look at our app, let me zoom out just a tiny bit, number list, and then open that up, number item. Number item has a prop called remove, which is a function from the parent. So each one of them has a remove. And if we call it, which is all we have to do inside of number item, on click equals this.props.remove. So we pass it down as a prop, but it's not defined in the child. And you can see it's working. It is calling remove inside of the parent. So this is one approach, but the downside of this approach is that we're making a bunch of new functions right here each time, and it's the same issue we saw before, whether we're using bind or an arrow function. If we're doing it inline, if we're actually setting the context, setting this inline in our render, we're going to make a bunch of new functions every time we call render, or we don't even call render, every time React renders for us, which happens all the time. Whenever something changes on here, new functions just created, and so on. So is there a better way where we can use a single bound function? We don't have to continually bind over and over. Yes, there is. I'm going to show it to you right now. Okay, so I've made two brand new components, better number list and better number item. They are currently copy and pasted from number list and number item. I just changed the names, better number item is what we're rendering, but that's it. So the goal is to remove this where we're actually binding over and over, creating new functions inside of render. So let's go ahead and just remove that right now. And what I'm going to do instead is bind once in the constructor as we've seen before. So this dot remove equals this dot remove dot bind this. And we can just pass remove as this dot remove. So it's a prop called remove just like before, but we're going to run into an issue with the way it's structured right now. So we bind it to better number list and we pass it through as a prop called remove. Then on the other end, inside of better number item, we're calling this .props.remove, but the problem is that we're not passing the argument. We need to know which number is being removed. And right now, we're not going to get an error. It's just not going to do what we want. To show you what's happening, if we console.log inside of remove, I'll say removing, and then afterwards, let's console.log the value of num. What do you think num is going to be set to? It might be surprising. Let's test it out. So I've already rendered my second number list. I should change the text actually. This one will be the better number list. Okay, so this is the original, this is the better one. The original still works. We click, there's no error. We're not getting like a binding issue where this is undefined. If we look at what's being printed out, it is calling remove, but what is the value of num? It's an event object. So when we set up an event handler, like we have over here, the default value that's passed in to our handler is the event object itself. Instead of calling this.props.remove directly, we're going to add an extra layer in between, a little bit of abstraction. So instead of this.props.remove, we're going to call some method. It's up to us to name it handle remove, handle click. We've seen this a million times, well, not a million times, but we've made a bunch of click handlers. So we're going to define that up here, handle remove. And this is where we would potentially use the event object that's passed in automatically. We're not going to utilize it now. And then we call this.props.remove from inside of this function. And we can pass in the value that we're removing. Well, how do we have access to that value? It's also been passed in as another prop. We passed in remove as a prop and value as a prop. This.props.value. This isn't going to work just yet though. What's going to happen? We've seen this quite a few times. Cannot read property props if undefined. That's telling us that the value of this is undefined inside of handle remove. Just like we've had to bind any event handler that uses the keyword this inside of it. So we need our constructor, standard stuff we put in here, super props, and then this dot handle remove equals this dot handle remove dot bind. We can reach up to the parent and say, hey, I need you to change something, which will cause a re-render. So to wrap up, this is the flow. A parent component defines a function. We pass that function down as a prop to a child component, and then the child component invokes that prop method, remove in our case. The parent function is then called, remove, setting new state, or usually setting new state as it did in our example, which then causes a re-render because the state changed. So a couple rules to keep in mind. These aren't hard rules, but let's call them light suggestions. So it's always better to bind higher if possible. If you don't need to bind inside the child component, then don't do it. If you need some sort of argument or parameter, pass it down to the child as a prop and then bind in the parent and in the child, like we just did. I like to avoid inline arrow functions and binding inside of render if possible. We talked about, performance reasons, but I also did mention it's pretty unlikely you'll actually notice any sort of impact. Things happen so quickly, it's not usually a problem, but it's good to know that it could be a problem, especially if you're working on much larger applications. It can be problematic, but for us, it probably doesn't matter. I just like to avoid it. No need to bind in the constructor and make an inline function, so you don't need to bind and inside of render and inside the constructor. Do one or the other, and I always prefer in the constructor. Lastly, and most importantly, if you ever get stuck, don't let yourself feel paralyzed, worrying and stressing about performance, and if you're binding in the wrong place, just make sure you can get something to work. If you can get your components to talk to one another, you've got children talking to the parent, and by talking, I mean affecting the state in the parent, causing a re-render. That's all that matters, and then you can refactor later if you need to. So don't freak out about it. I know we just talked a lot about binding and the ways that are good and bad, but at the end of the day, the only bad way is the way that doesn't work at all. So just make sure you get something working, and then we can refactor. Okay, I know this was a lot to take in. We'll get more practice if you're lost.